All right. Good morning, everyone. I have the coveted spot right before lunch. The only spot better than this is the last spot in the conference. So I should have asked Richard for that one. Going to talk about, as Dan just said, the DANE alternative to the X.509 certificate model that we're all familiar with. So just to make sure everyone's all familiar at a minimum level, let me talk just a little bit about how SSL or TLS, if you prefer, works today. So it really, by any measure, has been fantastically successful. But there have been some highly publicized failures, notably Komodo last March and DigiNotar last summer. You know, in those cases, we had certificate authorities unknowingly issuing fraudulent certs and potentially causing a great deal of damage. It looks like at least the DigiNotar certs were used in Iran, perhaps to nefarious purposes. So, the authentication uses X.509 certs, and the server sends the cert at the start. Of course, how do you know that the certificate that the server's sending is legitimate? And that's where the certificate authorities come in. The CAs, of course, vouch for the public keys of a server. The cert inside it basically has a statement that says, this resource, this named entity has this public key, and then the CA signs it. And if you trust the CA, and clients do trust multiple certificate authorities, then that transits the trust from your trust of the CA. Since it signs the cert, then you therefore trust the contents of the cert, which says the server has this key, and you trust the server. Well, there's some problems with that. One is that it conflates authentication with trustworthiness. So, from an authentication standpoint, what I mean is the assertion that this is an authentic cert. This named entity in the cert has this public key. So that's just authentication. But what we've seen in the CA model is they go beyond that, and they also make some statements about the trustworthiness of the named entity. And there are different levels of this. There are domain validated certificates, which is nowadays the minimum, which basically the CA is confirming that, yeah, this organization exists and it controls this domain name. Because of the problems with that it is relatively weak authentication, we have extended validation. That's been around for 6 or 7 years at this point. And that requires that the named entity pass stronger checks, that the certificate authority sees legal proof that the organization exists and proof that someone with the legitimate identity belonging to that organization is requesting the certificate. So you get a little more assurance that what you see from the cert really is the cert for the named entity. So, but that's the issue, that we're combining authentication and trustworthiness in one function. And the real issue with this model, though, is that we have a situation where it's only as strong as the weakest certificate authority. So for flexibility, clients trust multiple certificate authorities. Well, it depends on your certificate authority list, but around 150 is a reasonable number based on what you see in Mac OS or the Mozilla browser or the various different browsers. So you trust multiple certificate authorities for flexibility, and you also trust them equivalently. That's just the way this model has developed. And what that means then is that any certificate authority can vouch for anybody. And the converse of that is that means that if you're a named entity, if you have a server and you want a certificate, you can't specify who can vouch for you. Any one of these CAs are all trusted equally, and they can all vouch for you. And so that means that if the weakest one is compromised, that affects everyone because they can vouch potentially for everyone, which is exactly what we saw. That's why the Komodo and the DigiNotar vulnerabilities, or compromises, I should say, that's why they were so damaging, because they could make they can and they did make assertions about the identity of Google and Yahoo and very popular websites. So I want to talk about the attack surface of the CA model and why it is that we have CAs that can be compromised, and if you want to attack this, where do you go? So there are multiple different places. I have them coming up on the next slide. This just illustrates with we have the client in the middle there talking to a server in the upper left. The client knows about all the certificate authorities. That's the list of keys down there, the CA list. Also, the client will check the status of the certificate either with by downloading a certificate revocation list, which is the old way, or by checking in real time with OCSP, the online certificate status protocol. But either way, those are two different ways to check, is this particular cert that I'm being presented with, is it valid? And then the thing that happened at the beginning of all this was the DNS lookup that I have on the right, which was how the server, or excuse me, how the client found the server in the first place. So all of these make up the attack surface for the CA model. And if we add it up, we have a pretty large attack surface. So what can you attack? Well, the first is all the CAs that everybody trusts. So that's this list of, on the order of 150. So that's the attack that people think of. And indeed, that's an issue because, as I said, the weakest one is the one you can go after, whoever that is, for whatever reason. But there are other attack vectors that we should keep in mind. One is the certificate status check, the OCSP servers and the CRL servers. You could go after those because if you could have a fraudulent certificate but make it impossible for someone to discover that it's fraudulent, that it's been revoked, then that's a way that you could attack. And another way that you don't necessarily think of is the name servers that host these OCSP servers, the CRL servers, and even the target domain of the server itself and all its predecessor domains. Because in a world that we have right now without omnipresent DNSSEC, if you can compromise the DNS and cause someone to go to the different web server to begin with, that's an attack as well as an attack on the CA infrastructure. So let me just illustrate. We've got some graphs to illustrate this transitive trust issue from a DNS perspective. So this just shows the dependencies of Starbucks.com. So we have the Starbucks.com zone. You're just going to have to believe me when I point out what all these are. But they're in there's PDFs embedded in the file when you download the presentation. You can zoom in if you really want to check my work. But in the upper right is the Starbucks.com zone, and it depends on servers that are named in NSTLD.com. So then this is NSTLD.com and its named servers, and that depends on com, and we have the root and net in there. So those are all the servers that theoretically, if you could compromise one of those, if we don't have DNSSEC, you can sort of change the resolution path and make somebody believe the wrong thing. This is a relatively simple one. You're always going to have that stuff on the left because that's the way. Well, I shouldn't say always. If for .com and .net, that's the dependency graph for those because of the way the .com and the .net servers are currently named. Here's something a little more complicated. Not to pick on Bulgaria, but this is a more complicated graph. We just chose the one that was the most spaghetti-like. So .bg is way up there in the right, and because .bg's name servers are named in a bunch of different domains, you inherit all that transitive trust, and you end up with a dependency graph that looks like this, and you're more exposed. So what can you do about this problems with the CA model? And that's where DANE comes in. So DANE is the name of an IETF working group, which stands for DNS-based authentication of named entities. And really the purpose of DANE and how it works is really very simple. It's simply transiting trust from DNSSEC to a TLS certificate. So you take the trust that you have in whatever level that may be, you take the trust that you have in a particular signed zones assertion, and they authenticate a particular certificate, and then you can trust that certificate. So things are very far along with the DANE working group. We're now in the 18th revision of the protocol document, and it has been sent. It's been requested for publication. The area director has come back with some comments, like literally just yesterday. So the point is, the ball is rolling. There's still working group last call, there's ITF last call. But it's well on its way to being an official standard, and it adds a new DNS record type called TLSA, and the TLSA record holds certificate info, and you put the TLS record at a particular domain name and there's a port and a protocol label as well. So in the example that I have, if you were going to connect to www.example.com over TCP to port 443, and if there were a TLS server there, if you're following the DANE protocol, you would look up a TLSA record at that domain name, and the TLSA record would tell you something about the certificate that you can expect, and you use the information in the TLSA record to authenticate the certificate that you get when you establish the TLS connection. So there are multiple options for this cert info. The one that everyone, I think, thinks of when, because this is obviously not a new idea, this had been in the air for a long time, and finally DNSSEC enables us to do this. And the idea that I think everybody thought of was that you would use DNSSEC to match a specific cert, so that you would get a cert presented to you by the TLS server. You would look up something in DNSSEC, in this case the TLSA record. That would say this particular cert is trusted, and you would compare and you would go, okay, yep, the cert matches, therefore I can keep going. But DANE added some additional options that I think are pretty interesting. You can lock your particular certificate you can require not just a particular certificate, but one issued by a certificate authority. So you can allow a little more freedom for the certificate that you're going to get. So this would allow a domain owner to say, well, I know that I always use Symantec to issue my certs, so I want to put an assertion in DNS that's authenticated with DNSSEC that says you'll only see certificates from Symantec when you connect to my servers. If you see anything else, don't trust it. So I think that's a compromise. It still uses the flexibility of the CA model and all the all the good stuff that we get from that, combined with DNSSEC to provide a check and balance. And I think that will probably see us prolonging the life of the CA model, in that we can make use of the CA infrastructure in the DANE model. You can also specify a particular trust anchor that the cert has to chain for. So if your organization has its own internal CA, you could put that CA cert in DNS, and then you could have the flexibility to issue certs from that and use them on various web servers, and you would just need to put your CA cert, your trust anchor cert, in DNS, and it would operate the same way, and that someone would see that and they would go, okay, I'm going to trust anything issued by this particular cert, and then that would cover everything. So there's a little bit more flexibility in the protocol than you might have realized had you not been following its development. An important point, though, is that DANE is only doing authentication of certificates. There are absolutely no statements about trustworthiness at all. That's not a factor in this protocol. So it removes that conflation that we have in the CA model. So there are some liabilities with DANE. This is just a partial list, the ones that we included in the paper and talked about. DNS response modification, and by this I mean monetization that some ISPs do, turning NX domains into search pages with ads, or the kind of filtering that we've seen from proposed by governments. Those of you in the U.S. and those of you not in the U.S. probably followed the really unfortunate legislation that we had proposed that is dead for the moment, that would have required ISPs to basically be enforcers for intellectual property and content interests. So this is not so much a threat to DANE in particular as it is to DNSSEC specifically, and DNS specifically. If you can no longer trust DNS, and you can't trust DNSSEC because things won't validate, then that's a problem with anything you would want to authenticate with DNSSEC. Another issue is the transitive trust that I talked about. That's not only a threat to the CA model, it's also a threat to DANE in a world today where we still don't have ubiquitous DNSSEC authentication. You could look at the missing policy framework of the CAs as a liability, in that all you have is authentication and not statements about trustworthiness. You could, you know, the converse of that is somebody could say, well, the CAs do add this valuable check that ensures that this particular entity is legitimate to whatever the bar is for legitimacy, depending on what the CA validates, and that's missing here. And you could look at that as a liability. You could also look at the need for DNSSEC validation as a liability, in that we don't have a lot of DNSSEC validation right now, and that's going to be required to make this work. Another issue that that VeriSign's looked at with some concern is what we've seen proposed. That sort of, it's kind of like DANE, but it's taking a spin in another direction, and that's putting DNSSEC data into certificates. This is something that Chrome is doing that we're pretty concerned about, and you know, I think the main motivation is to speed up resolution and to ensure that validation is going to be successful. So rather than requiring DNS to do the DNSSEC validation, the idea is you actually take all that DNSSEC validation data that you would have discovered through DNS, and by that I mean keys and signatures, and you put it in the certificate. So the web server sends perhaps a self-signed certificate, but included as extra data in that certificate is all this DNSSEC metadata, keys and certificates. And so you get it all in one blob and you can use it. Now, that has its appeal in that you get everything at once and you can make immediate use of it, but the problem is that has potential to be frozen in time, and that will make key rollovers more difficult. That'll give us one more obstacle to a system that already has some problems in that area, or not problems. It has the deck stacked against it. So we're really concerned about that, and you know, taking this opportunity and the opportunity in the paper to point out that, you know, we don't think that's a very good idea. And in terms of the future of DANE, and for that matter DNSSEC in general, it would be very straightforward to take this concept of authenticating SSL certs and move it to SMIME. You know, that's a nut we've never cracked. We've never been able to have a certificate distribution mechanism that works on any scale. You know, I have an SMIME certificate issued to me from VeriSign, and I don't bother to use it because it was issued by an intermediate cert that nobody knows about. So, you know, it doesn't do me any good to sign my email because nobody can validate it, so I just use PGP instead. I'm not sure they can validate that either, but in theory it would be easier. So if we could have a way to distribute certs in DNS and authenticate them in DNS, that would give new life to SMIME. You know, another possibility is a different an add-on protocol to add the trustworthiness checks back in that CAs do. This, you know, this is not necessarily DANE. This is some follow-on to DANE, some other protocol. You know, I don't know what that would look like, but that would be an attempt to get back this value that we have the CAs providing. And then I think a positive thing about DANE is that it provides motivation for DNSSEC deployment. In that hopefully this will be the killer app for DNSSEC, the thing that everybody wants and that will motivate DNSSEC deployment. We can only hope. So that's the end of my presentation, and I would be happy to take any questions.